but perhaps if Mary, if you'd like to present on those first, and then we'll have questions and then debate.
So I just wanted to clarify today that the purpose of this report is twofold. So firstly, it's because this is a statutory process and we need this material and this documentation on council and to have been debated, and that's why we've presented on a number of occasions. But secondly, the purpose of it is to really narrow down the options that the Working Party will come back to you on. So it's not to make a definitive decision about a proposal, it's just to narrow down the options. And the key aspects that the Working Party is seeking direction on is the treatment of Banks Peninsula and whether the council is open to considering an increase in number of wards and councillors. So those are the two matters that are really the Working Party seeking direction from. So if I can perhaps take the rest of the report as read, is that?
Yeah, no, that's
okay?
Fine. So, so the first item is that the council determine its preference on A or B, and that's in relation to the existing Banks Peninsula ward being retained and considered to be an isolated community, or that the Banks Peninsula community be combined with other communities to form a ward that complies with the definition of fair representation. Now, just in terms of that, I mean, I'm of a mind to move number B, I mean letter B, the second of the two, but there would be, I think, support for a community board to still represent the Akaroa Wairewa one. So how do you formulate that, or does that have to be included as a part of the recommendation? No. So when the next report comes back to council with the options, it will actually have identified community boards, and it can come with an option that has a division for Akaroa Wairewa. Right. So because I mean, I wouldn't want to be seen to be moving or supporting a recommendation that didn't have that. Yep. So maybe if I move B, but it reads that the Banks Peninsula community be combined with other communities to form a ward that complies with the definition of fair representation under Section 19B(2) of the Local Electoral Act 2001. Preserving, however, the option of the Akaroa / Wairewa Community Board.
Yes, and being treated as an isolated
being treated as an isolated community.
Yep, great.
Do I have a seconder for that? Yanni? Yep. Okay. Now, does anyone want to ask questions about that, or do you want to, Phil?
Thank you, because in many ways I think there's some questions around the whole report too, not just that sort of part of it.
No, we're dealing like part by part. So we'll deal with the second issue, which is the numbers, next, but we'll just deal with the...
Okay, I have got a question around it. It's that it's really, if in fact we support B, that it be combined with other communities. Wondering if you can tell me what then the impact on the other wards may be, and for example, how might the change in population mean that in fact in setting up a new ward that communities of interest might also be crossed?
Yes, so the impact on other wards will depend on the number of wards you have. So with the current number of wards, Banks Peninsula would need to come right across the hills. So it would need to come right across the hills either side, and right round from Hallsville, Westmoreland, Craycroft, Cashmere, Heathcote, Redcliffe, Sumner. So it would become quite a large ward to get the right ratios with the current ward number. Depending on your if you had other ward numbers, it would get smaller. So that's would depend on the ward size. So the Working Party could come back with some varying options around that when they get to mapping stages.
Thanks, Mary, because my understanding is that the shape of any new ward also has to take into account those local communities, and you mentioned some of them specifically.
Yes. Yep, so any structure that the council has under this representation review will have to combine communities of interest. So the communities of interest have been defined by the community so far as being quite small, and any structure has to combine those. But the key way of doing this is to looking for ways that they can be combined and still retained within one ward or one community board. And other ways you can do that is by having divisions within your community board structure. So within a community board structure, instead of having every community board member elected at large, you would have divisions. So you would have, for this community board, for example, you may have 2 community board members elected from that division, 2 from that division, 2 from that division, a bit like Akaroa Waireira does at the moment.
And then part of that sort of compilation too is we wouldn't be able, and the Commission wouldn't want to, split any communities of interest between 2 different wards.
That's what they would be looking to ensure that whether council had done that if it gets to an appeal, which they generally do. But I think that that's something that you would ask the working party to identify in the options that they bring back to you, is to make sure that communities are not split, strong communities are not split.
David?
The last couple of elections we have had a community of minority numbers allowed. What do you think the Local Government Commission response would be to an ongoing situation there? My take is that they've sort of allowed it, but I think there's an expectation that we, as a city, will have to address that situation.
The last Commission's findings, they were relatively clear that they expected the council to revisit all their community wards, and particularly to revisit the Banks Peninsula, because they were, I think there's a quote in here that state from the Commission findings that they said it would be hard to justify Banks Peninsula to continue as an isolated community, particularly around that Littleton basin. So they had flagged to council that they expected not only a close look at Banks Peninsula, but also a close look at all the other wards. And as it's turned out, the council does have to look at them because the numbers post-earthquake have really skewed across all wards.
That effectively sort of signals that option B is really the direction we have to go. Yep.
Yanni?
As Chair of the Working Party, I just want to bring your attention to page 237, which has a table of wards that currently have an exception to that rule. Now, interesting to note that Banks Peninsula sits at 70% deviation. Southland District Stewart Island has 83%, so that's probably, I mean, that is the greatest deviation in New Zealand, but I think everyone can understand why Stewart Island could make the case. The next highest, apart from Banks Peninsula, would be Golden Bay, and so some of the community feedback was, well, use the Golden Bay arguments, but even if you still do that, you still end up significantly deviating from that thing, which is why I think it would be incredibly hard to justify it in front of the Local Government Commission. But it's not to say, as we go through the options in terms of the ratios, that we might get a smaller deviation than this current 70%. But so I just wanted to, I think that table is really useful to understand just how hard the arguments would be in front of the Local Government Commission around the need for an isolated community for that entire.
Yep. Phil?
I guess just one sort of obvious but not so obvious point, because in some ways it's removed from us. But my understanding would be that even though, for example, especially because Banks Peninsula will be incorporated into other wards, that in fact the people in that area will still want to ensure that they have sufficient representation, that's fair, and we've made reference to the community boards. But that's what I'm checking is that something that the people of Banks Peninsula are likely to want to have a say in?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you can.
Maybe Andrew would like to comment on that, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I mean, I was intending making some comments in the debate, and I can do that now if that's appropriate, or I can do that at the appropriate time.
Do you need Andrew to respond to that before we debate it?
I'm happy either way. I think that isn't, because we're voting on this, that part, you know, it's about representation for the people of Banks Peninsula. Andrew is the local ward councillor, but it's important for us, I think, to understand that in making this decision. So I don't mind either way. I'm happy to wait.
All right.
Unless Mary wants to comment on it.
So Jeannie may want to comment because she was responsible for a large proportion of the consultation, but my understanding was Banks Peninsula was favouring initially being an isolated community, but actually realised that if that was not possible, they wanted to be retained as a Banks Peninsula community and come into another ward. So
That is right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've just changed the wording on advice that because isolated community is a phrase that only goes with wards, so preserving, however, the option of the Akaroa Wairewa Community Board being retained as a separate entity. So, yeah, so that's the... it means that the option, because I mean, I'm hearing the word option, right. So we can't actually make the decision here and now without advice. So, all right, so I'll open it up for debate. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to speak to this, and I've been, I guess, part of the journey of the engagement that we've had with the public. I've attended, I think, 4 different meetings on the peninsula, and it's fair to say that the people of the peninsula pretty much started out with a view that the peninsula should be retained as is, that the current arrangements should remain as they are, and that the argument should be put that it was a community, an isolated community. As the level of understanding has increased and as time has gone on, I think there's a greater understanding that the peninsula, numbers-wise, is totally out of whack with where we would expect it to be. And we need to be mindful of the comments that the previous commissioners had made and the likely expectations this time around. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that there isn't a view on the peninsula that the peninsula should remain isolated. There are certainly some communities and some people on the peninsula that do feel that and do feel that quite strongly. However, I think it's important to look at the wider picture of how the peninsula fits within the city and how the numbers can be dealt with. I do think the Akaroa Wairewa Community Board been maintained as the status quo is certainly one way of dealing with the isolated community aspects of Akaroa and the outer bays. In fact, the area beyond Gebby's Pass has been isolated from the rest of the city, and I certainly welcome that and would continue to support it. The fear on the peninsula is that the peninsula would be drowned out by a large number of urban people that would form part of the same ward. And I think as long as that's addressed, the people of the peninsula and certainly the community board chairs and the community board members would support an extended peninsula ward. One of the things that we have seen particular resistance to has been a concept of splitting the peninsula. So there was originally some conversation around the Littleton Harbour part of the peninsula would amalgamate with other areas of the Port Hills, and the Akaroa Wairewa part of the peninsula could possibly amalgamate with Hallswell. The result being that the peninsula would be split, and that certainly was one of the things that we've heard time and time again, both in meetings and anecdotally, wouldn't be supported by the people of the peninsula who do see themselves as one community of interest. And there's been particular support from the 4 Runanga on the peninsula to keep the peninsula together, as well as that respects the borders of those Runanga areas. So it's for those reasons that I'm happy to move from, I think, perhaps a position that I would previously have held that the peninsula should be seen as an isolated community. My view has changed over time, and I think it's fair to say that the view of a majority of the community, including the community board chairs and community board members, has changed over time as well. But I think it's important that we respect that the peninsula is a community of interest, which the fear really is that it's not drowned out by a large urban community in any arrangement, and appreciating that some of that can be achieved through subdivisions and some of it can be achieved through other mechanisms as well. So, yeah, certainly happy in that context to support option B.
Phil?
I'll also support option B, and I think though it's important, and like clearly it needs to change in terms of the Commission's own earlier decisions, and also that it doesn't meet the population thresholds by a mile, as indicated in the chart that Yanni referred to. But I think it's important for us to learn and keep in mind around this, in making the further decisions today, what we learn from the way Banks Peninsula has actually operated as a ward and how the community boards have really assisted that so well. I think it's a really good example of a smaller community actually thriving in terms of getting things done, in terms of local governance. And I pay tribute to the board chairs involved and to the councillor and previous councillors who represented their ward. But it is an example to me of where a small community has worked really well in terms of local governance. And we need to keep that in mind when we eventually decide on the future boundaries for that ward. So we make sure that in fact it's lined up in terms of similar communities of interest and all those geographic features.
Raf?
Yeah, thank you. I'm certainly in favour of option B, but I just want to add something else to it. I mean, not to the thingy, but to the conversation, is that for me, a lot of this stuff is about the community boards and the delegations. And I think if we get the delegations right and actually shift all the power to community boards to deal with stuff in their communities, then actually this stuff doesn't become such a big deal. Yeah. I think councillors should be dealing with metropolitan issues. We have stuff come up at council meetings all the time, which actually I don't need to know about. Even the Brighton stuff today, let them sort it out. It's stuff in their community assets, they can manage them, sort them out. So I think as long as you've got the Akara Community Board and it has the proper delegations to deal with stuff in the area, then actually I don't think it's such a problem to be part of a big award. So for that reason, I'm supportive of that.
Thank you. Jamie?
I'll be brief with this. I've actually changed my view on this first issue. When I read the report and went through it, I actually felt that Banks Peninsula was an isolated community purely because it is actually an isolated community. You drive through another blooming council to get there. So I think though what Raf was talking about in the delegations, I think really struck a chord with me. And in this instance, I think it's actually putting this totally into practice and taking the guidance from the people with that knowledge. And Andrew himself is supporting B, and no one's going to know it better than him. So I'll change my view on that, and if that can work, we can iron out those issues. But I do think that the real key is with the delegations resting with the community there, and I think the community boards empowering them is probably one of the most significant changes that we could be making. So I'll roll with B on this issue.
Paul?
I've got to highlight B is my pick of the recommendations, and I think it's really more about seeing Christchurch as a whole, and we shouldn't have isolated communities if we're a whole and we're working together and being effective. So I'll take on board actually Councillor Clearwater's point about the fact that they have been represented really, really well. Even though they are geographically isolated, I think as a city we are actually looking after our fringes exceptionally well. So we also got to just view that in the way we make our decisions. We are Christchurch goes right through to Akaroa. Part of it does go through another council, that's just the way it is. But I think we just need to be seen as looking at our city as a whole rather than actually lots of isolated communities.
Very good. All right, I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you. Right, the second item. Yeah.
Could I just make one comment, which is just on the delegations, just to give you the heads up that the workshop around board community delegations is prior to you having to determine your final proposal.
Yeah.
So the timing will work out.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think Raf's comments are particularly relevant to the second resolution. Now, which one do you want to? You want to move D?
I'd like to second that.
All right. That's.
Yeah, I'll second say.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, well, I mean, clearly there's going to be a different view, and I'm around this one. So, I'm just... Okay.
Process. As chair of the working party, I mean, normally the chair of the working party would move the recommendations, and I'm happy to move D. Perhaps it's good to vote on that and then see what happens, and then come back to the other one, which is if D's not carried. I don't really see how else you can do it with those two.
No, well, that's true. You can't really. That there are an either or. Yeah, I guess that. Well, let's have a discussion first, because I think that there are a number of questions that I certainly want to pose. I mean, I don't favour this option at all, and in many respects, it's for a number of the reasons that Raf mentioned before. But I want to get some questions out first. So it seemed to me when I read the report that a number of people were concerned about making a call on the number of councillors before they knew what the budget impact would be. Now, in the olden days, and actually not that long ago, the Remuneration Authority used to have a, a pool. So all of the councillors and all the community board members were paid for from a pool, and once that pool was established, you couldn't get any more. So if the number of councillors reduced dramatically, like they did in 2004, was it? Then the amount per councillor was paid almost doubled overnight. And so the way that I read the report was a number of people were concerned now that if they said they wanted more councillors, then it was going to cost a lot more money. And so could you give us some advice here at the table? How much more does each councillor cost if we did introduce a system that resulted in more councillors?
Look, I would really like, it's fair to ask questions, I think we should, but I want to make the point, and in effect it's like a point of order, that in fact if we're going to raise other questions that are away from the recommendations and what's in the report, we can ask them. However, a whole lot of other questions could be asked in relation to representation, like for example the cost of community boards and that kind of thing. So,
well, hang on, my question is in order. My question is in order.
I'm just saying
a number of people said in the report. Okay. That would you like me to quote from the report?
I think the main thing I need clarification about is that in fact we are asking questions.
But I did ask a question. How much would it cost per councillor extra? So if we have one extra, two extra, and how many extra does this 1:16 ratio produce? I think it's 19 councillors. So how much does that cost over and above what we get now?
So we have sought concrete advice from the Remuneration Authority, and they haven't provided that yet, about because what they've said is that it's no longer a pool of money and that it is based on job sizing. So we've gone back to them and asked them for advice about what would be the difference hypothetically if the council went from 10 to 20, and we're seeking that advice from them at the moment. So,
but we said we needed this today.
We did. That's right. But Daryl's been ringing them 2 or 3 times a day for the last week and hasn't got a response yet.
But sorry, there is a memo that came round to councillors on the 20th of February that addressed this very point. And the key thing to note from that memo is that there's a base councillor rate using a formula that reflects job size, hours of work, and uses a formula involving population and expenditure to reach a figure. So in very simple terms, it will go like through a job sizing thing. So presumably if you had less responsibilities, less population, per ward, you would have less pay.
No. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the amount, because individuals have raised it during the process, and we said on Monday we needed the information today because we were having this very debate.
Yes, but unfortunately the council does not set remuneration for elected members.
I know.
The Remuneration Authority does. So, I mean, I don't want to raise a point of order, but it is something that's outside our control.
No, the public want to know before they make a decision, and I want to know what the result is. I'm not in favour of this one, of having 19 councillors sitting around the table if I don't know how much more that is going to cost the city of Christchurch.
Right, so my understanding is once we decide on the way we wish to go forward today through these preferences, then a report will be compiled with the various options which will show you what that expenditure could be. But recognising that remuneration is the subject of the Remuneration Authority, and I mean I've been here long enough to know that there is no certainty through that authority as to what we will be paid. When the community board members had their sizes doubled, and their numbers cut, they got a reduction in pay. But yet councils got a huge increase.
Because they used to be in a pool, and that year they were in a pool. They're not in a pool now, and I don't think it's unreasonable for the public of Christchurch to know how much extra per councillor it would be. But okay, it's clear that we haven't got the answer.
We've definitely sought that since.
But it will be an extra cost, won't it?
It could be. It could be an extra cost, but we don't know how much extra cost that will be. So that's why we're trying to seek some advice and remuneration that wasn't available today.
And legally, that's not a consideration in terms of the representation review. So, I mean, it's important information and we need to be aware of it. But in terms of the process that we're going through, it is not a consideration. It is not legally part of the consideration of, as we need to go through, identifying communities of interest, determining effective
we've been asked one question today.
And consider fairness of representation of electors.
No, we've been asked whether we want to retain the current member population ratio of approximately 1 to 26 or propose a member population ratio closer to the Metro New Zealand City average of 1 to 16,500.
Madam Chair, through you, could I just say that that is possibly a badly worded recommendation?
Yes.
And it should have been more, does the council want to retain the existing ratio or would it consider alternative ratios? And so then when the options come back to council, they could come back with some other options of current, more, different numbers of more. So it shouldn't have been as cut and dry, and I apologise for that.
Well, I'm a little concerned because the way the ratio, I mean, when I heard that the ratio being proposed was the New Zealand average, I was actually surprised to find out that actually it's not the New Zealand, the Metro average, when I noticed that Auckland is 1 to 70,000, and that's what, I mean, it's really the small metro. Yeah, but Auckland is massive.
Different legislation.
Can I just say, we probably need some more information about Auckland because they're under different legislation, I understand, and in fact they have local boards. What my question really too then is, since we're obtaining information about the costs of an additional councillor, although that might be hard to reckon, can we also get some estimate of the costs of strengthening community boards, for example, if they would have more resources and bases and that kind of thing, because I'm aware that some of them don't have even their own sort of meeting room space. So that would be information I would also like as well.
That came back in the various options rather than.
That's fine. If it comes back in the options, I'm fine with that. Mary. Thank you.
I mean, the other thing that I'm really strongly of the view, but I mean I'm completely biased because I say this as the mayor, is that I want an equal number of wards, because if you don't have an equal number of councillors, then the mayor is just, I mean, doesn't have essentially a vote that can be a deadlock breaker.
can change the standing orders to be a casting vote, and I have no problem with that. Like, in all honesty, you are the mayor, so why don't you just do it?
Okay,
it's
I'll
easily
get a paper
solved.
drawn up.
To simply say the mayor has a casting vote means that there's no deadlocks. I have no problem with that. You do.
That's right. Ooh.
Might be a dead
I
heat.
might do that. I hadn't thought of that. Right.
Just change the standing orders.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I mean, there's obviously going to have to be a lot of questions on this. But anyway, but you need to have a decision on this today.
Not firm, just a steer because what the Working Party's asking for was Banks Peninsula was the most important.
Yeah, we've done that.
Yep, and you've done that. So the second one was just a steer from for us to create options from. So a steer that you would like options of the existing of more or of more. So you could ask for. You don't need to make a decision on
not
this.
Less.
Just give us a steer, not less. Oh well, you could say less.
Well,
I mean, I'm just worried that the resolution's been changed without the consent of the
no, well,
mover.
I haven't touched it, but
No, I know you haven't. Just what we're looking at on the screen.
well, hang on. But there's lots of people who want to ask questions. So let's get all the questions on the table and let's see if we can move this along. Because if we can't move this along today, then you've got Akaroa to be getting on with, and you may have to just revisit this. But anyway, it's Jimmy. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, I missed it. It was a mistake. So we'll go Pauline, then Jimmy, then Tim, then Jamie, then Andrew. Oh, God.
Thanks, Leanne, and I'm sorry that you missed me. My question is, for my clarification, that if D was passed, would that actually preclude an option to carry on with the status quo, which is C? So if we pass D, we could still end up with C eventually. That's my question, and I
is the preference of council. You're not making a firm decision. You're giving a preference to guide the Working Party, but the Working Party might come back.
But the mover and seconder haven't accepted the wording change, so...
No, the existing recommendation is the report recommends that whether its preference is to. So that's the existing recommendation is just giving an indication of its preference. It's not a firm decision. It's an indication to the Working Party of its preference.
Right, so it's just a preference at this stage.
That's
They'll
right.
still come back.
What's the big deal?
Come back with options.
Thank you.
So, Jimmy?
Thank you, Matt.
I have one question, because if we review the 2.7 on page 216, particular here emphasize we did have the preliminary consultation from 3,000 residents consulted and seeking the first two bullet points. The number of councillors be increased, the size of wards be decreased. However, there's still no quantified. It's only the in principle. So regarding to the number, probably you mentioned earlier is better. Is a kind of flexible. One is you consider currently one ratio 1 to 26,001. The other one is more flexible. Not only one is a current ratio 1 to 16, maybe 1 to the 18 or 1 to 20 or etc. Because here no quantified feedback. Another one is regarding the council number. I still concerned. Is also my question. What is a function? And currently we partake of a council meeting, committee meeting, subcommittee meeting, task force, working group, and council at the moment still, based on local government act, we still in a community board member. We have so many the meeting will be fulfilled. This is my questions. This uncertainty whether we need to have a whole package to match this number of councillors.
No,
this is my question.
They're just asking for preferences at the moment. Yeah.
So there will be, we're asking for preferences because the Working Party was mapping a multitude of scenarios and getting nowhere. So this was giving some preferences, and the options will come back and they will be quite detailed. They will be, this is the option, the advantages and disadvantages of each option will be weighed up, and the financial implications of each option. This is really just trying to narrow the options from here to here.
Yeah. Yeah, because we can't have a whole, you know,
No.
sort of
We
pile
can't
of
enact for another
different-
100 years.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a sub-question. But if you have three options, if you give us later on, whether, for instance, the 20 the councillor, whether you have only 2 community board members to make, is a whole package.
That's not
or
the
just
question.
councillor?
That's not the
That'll
question
come
now.
back
Okay.
later.
Yeah.
That'll be debated.
Okay,
I just want to know.
so Tim, you were
Package.
next.
So indeed, all it is asking is to investigate an increase. That's all it's doing. It's not doing anything else. If we were going to say, so it's a question of, what? Yeah, but I mean, we've been going around in circles. If it's a question of money, let's get rid of 6 councillors and go close to Auckland's ratio. So it's just.
Oh, so that, yeah, that's I'll be happy to accept that as an amendment. Jamie?
It was more of a statement, but I just thought Daryl's memo that came out on Thursday was quite clear about the remuneration. So I didn't have really a question around that. So I just want to reiterate kind of what you said, is that the Remuneration Authority doesn't do it on how many councillors you've got. It's done on the population of the city and the workload. If you had 6 more councillors, it doesn't mean that people start halving the amount of councillors that a reply to all goes to, or an agenda doesn't get any smaller. So in essence, if you have 6 more councillors, it's going to cost about $600,000 more.
It's not true.
Oh, it will
It's
be.
not correct.
How job sizing occurs, and maybe we can get strategic pay to come in and explain it to you.
So perhaps
Councillors who have been through this
You
process
want to
will pay.
bring strategic
No,
pay
I
in to
don't.
explain
No, I
something?
don't. But, you know, I just...
Could
yeah,
we
it's just
wait on the
frustrating when
advice?
comments
Anyway,
are made.
yeah, we'll wait for the advice. We'll wait for the advice. Glenn?
Yes, I just wanted to check that the primary considerations here are the Local Electoral Act, including guidelines. Yeah.
So this is quite a stringently reviewed process by the Local Government Commission when it gets to that to them, and so there are quite clear steps that the council needs to follow, and it has to be quite a robust process, and it needs. That's why we've followed this process and reiterated out step by step and done each step.
It's fair to say that their response to our submission will come back on how well we've,
Absolutely.
our ability to address those
Absolutely.
considerations.
So when it's appealed to them, as it probably will be, is that our process was robust will be the critical thing they look at.
Thank you.
Phil?
I just want to ask you about the pre-engagement, because my understanding is that someone in the report you interviewed, or a huge number of people gave feedback, something like over 3,000, or it's extraordinary. But the question is really, on page 225, there's an outline of the process there that around the consultation, and I'm just and how that was done. I'm just and also the results of that too. The majority of feedback supported a lower ratio of population to councillors. What I'm wondering is, in terms of the processes, does that information about how that pre-engagement was done and who you all went to and the numbers involved, does that go to the Commission, or has it gone to the Commission? And also then, especially, would the Commission also take the feedback from that pre-engagement into account?
Yes, everything has to go to the Commission. So we are already bundling up every single submission that we got back, every single map we got back, every single notes of communities, because everything goes to the MPG. So the pre-engagement, we followed the process that was advised by the Commission. They advised the process to use, and we used it, and they have been monitoring and engaging with us every step of the way, and are quite supportive of the process used to date. From here, it has another engagement, another formal consultation process.
So, since the Commission are taking all that into account, can I assume that it would probably be unwise of us as a council to not take all of that into account too? That we should be taking the results of the pre-engagement and also understanding the processes and the work that was done, that we should take that into account?
It will definitely have to be, when you come to consider your options, you will definitely have to consider what the community feedback was.
Right. Yeah. I think that answers it. Thank you.
Were there other questions? Ali, David, Andrew.
And apologies for lateness this afternoon. Just following on from what Phil has just asked, what I'm really interested in, similar to some of the other issues we're dealing with, often we will hear something from the public, which of course you have to follow, you have to understand and you have to take into consideration. However, it may be that that has been stated for reasons, and I'm not suggesting that people don't understand what we do or what have you, but it may be that those come from a purely ideological position or a non-factual position or whatever, a gut feel. So your response or answer to Phil just then, how much fact and reality do you take into consideration with something like this when, if you followed what you were hearing only in the feedback, you may be, in fact, creating a situation that is unworkable?
So just to answer that in two parts is, one, the consultation was not based usually on one conversation. So Jenny ran a process where people put forward an idea and then she'd go back to them with, so this idea means a map and a ratio like this. Is this really what you wanted? And then it was revisited and re-looked at. So it was actually an iterative process for those things. The other thing is you'll see from the report is that a number of other factors other than the consultation have been taken into account. So there's particularly in that area of communities of interest, there's been a whole lot of factors that have been taken in, and they are listed on 4.7 of all the other factors that have been taken into account to identify communities of interest along with the consultation. And again, they are things that you will have to consider when you determine your options, and they will be outlined.
Additional quickly to that, the first point you made with regards to going back and, with iterations of suggestions. If the idea has come from a place that doesn't stack up in the first place, as far as, say, workload or whatever, that iteration isn't necessarily going to address that if you're doing it based on ratios of population and ward maps, is it? So what I'm saying is, if someone comes with an idea, it is then explored and there's another iteration or it's developed into a map, a geographical interpretation of what someone is asking for. Issues around how a ward works, what a workload is, what the major pieces of work that councillors have to do in community boards, that isn't necessarily going to factor into how you show what you've been showing in those maps. Sorry, I'm not explaining it very well.
And the communities and Jenny and her team, that some people said, oh no, actually that's not what I wanted. Actually, my first proposal, when I theoretically said it, when I see it on a map or I weigh up coverage or I weigh up what you isn't, and it was adapted.
That was mainly suggested on boundaries though, Mary. Would that be someone actually looking at the physical nature of what they were expecting in their consultation with you, not about what someone or a council or a community board actually has to do?
There was very large ongoing conversational debate in each group where we went back. We tried to factor all of that in, and all of those things came up in every conversation. People got really in deep. But I mean, this is not a really strict science, and what we did was not a total academically tested process, because some people said to us, well, look, I don't know, for example, what should happen about Banks Peninsula. Why don't we let the people on Banks Peninsula decide? Other people said, I can't tell you about the ratios because why don't you go and ask the councillors? So, I mean, because the councillors know what their workload is. Other people said, I don't know a councillor. If you've got a smaller number of councillors per population, I would like to know councillors. Quite a lot of people said that. So there's just so many factors involved in this. And when we come to your final decision making, we will have to take all these factors that the Local Government Commission wants into consideration and show to the Commission your answers as to why you went for your initial option and then your final option. So there's plenty more chances to debate all this as we go along. And I mean, you are the final decision makers before the Commission. Yeah. For your final one.
I don't want... No, wait. I've got a speaking order, but I don't want anyone to think for a minute that we are at all unhappy with the process. I mean, I think every one of us would want to congratulate the council staff for the way that they have been out there and pre-engaged with our communities about what is often a controversial issue. So, and Yanni's been leading the working group on behalf of elected members, and I think that he's done a sterling job in that regard. But there is going to be a weighting given to how, and that was just a perfect description of how some people, what they want isn't exactly how they're expressing what they want it delivered. So, and that will be subject to a lot of interpretation. I've got a couple of questions around that myself, but I've got David and then Andrew and then Raf.
Thank you. Look, I see this issue as being purely centred around Banks Peninsula because of the huge differential in their ratio, currently sort of 1,500. It's a bit of a numbers game, and if we had 7 wards as we have now with an equal population, there'd be something close to 51,000 in each ward, which means we would have to shift 42,000 people into the Banks Peninsula ward to make it equitable across the city. If we created another ward, we would have an average of 44,000 odd per ward, and we'd have to shift 36,000 into the Banks Peninsula ward. My question, I suppose, really centres around a scenario of going to the Electoral Commission and saying, we have an odd situation here with Banks Peninsula. What ratio of population to council would be an acceptable ratio for that commission? And I mean, maybe we end up with a sort of a 1 to 22 or 3 for the city, and Banks Peninsula might be at 1 to 12,000. Whether that's acceptable or not to the commission, I don't know. But we're either faced with the prospect of finding a small addition to Banks Peninsula which becomes palatable to the Electoral Commission, or we have a large chunk of the city added to Banks Peninsula to make it equitable. So for me, there's a couple of balls in the air. I think there may be a case to say, well, we do have a community of some exception. Can we accept a ratio of, say, 1 to 15, somewhere to 20,000 for Banks Peninsula?
We've already decided the Banks Peninsula question, though.
Well, it is for me. I mean,
no, we've already decided that. There is a percentage that you unders and overs. Yeah, plus or minus. What is it?
Plus or minus. But what I'm saying is, do we need to talk to the commission?
No. We are now in a position where it has to be plus or minus 10%.
10%. Yeah, but what I'm saying, can we actually put a case forward for the Banks Peninsula community for that?
You can't go outside.
No, still the plus or minus 10%, but the population base to be lower.
No. The point is that it can only be plus or minus 10%.
Yeah, but that's assuming that we have an equal number in the whole city.
I personally think that we have dealt with that in the first question we asked. So, Jenny.